I showed this table, and it revealed that companies that enter into a climate change agreement with the government can get a lower tax rate. In fact, 80% of their tax is waived, 80%. Which brings me to the subject of voluntary agreements. One of the problems with direct regulation is that unless we are talking about a small number of point sources, it requires a lot of knowledge on behalf of the government to get it right. Because it's typically a one-size-fits-all regulation, and unless the regulator really understands what is going on with a particular pollutant and where it comes from and what activities generate that pollution, it is very hard to get that regulation right. So it requires a lot of knowledge for the regulator. One way to overcome that information problem is if governments and industry negotiate over the emission targets and then agree on what to do. And the purpose of that negotiation is really to get the polluters, the industry involved, and to make sure that whatever regulation is on the table is not completely crazy and reflects the realities on the ground. And the outcome of this negotiation is then often laid down in a so-called voluntary agreement. But that voluntary really is a euphemism because in the background of the negotiations is if we don't agree voluntarily, then the regulator will impose some sort of policy, right? So it's not really voluntary. Good thing about voluntary agreements is that they make optimal use of the information within the industry, who know what they're doing, presumably, and where the pollution comes from and how it can best be mitigated. The main problem with voluntary agreements is public acceptance. Because essentially these are negotiations behind closed doors, and it may be that the government is negotiating on behalf of society as a whole, and maybe that it's taking the environmental concerns at heart, but maybe this is just a way for industry to lobby government and weaken environmental policy. So that's what voluntary agreements are about. We can make this slightly more formal. Let's assume that there is some sort of abatement cost function, and the abatement costs are C, and they're a function of A, and A is a level of emission reduction. And I'm just going to assume that these functions are linear, and then there's two levels of this cost function. If there is a mandatory program, then these are the costs, the constant Cm, and if it's a voluntary program, then the costs are Cv per unit of abatement A. And the argument I just made is that if industry has a say in this, then they will probably come up with a smarter way of reducing emissions than civil servants would. So the assumption here is that Cv is smaller than Cm. Abatement cost is lower if done voluntarily rather than mandated. The net social benefits are this function here, which is the benefit of abatement, the environmental pollution avoided minus the cost of reducing things. This is in the case of the voluntary program, this is in the case of the mandatory program, where the difference is the M that you see here. Graphically, this looks something as follows. Here we have the marginal environmental benefit curve, which is assumed to be linear, and here we have the marginal costs of abatement when the program is mandatory, and then the optimal level is when marginal benefits hit the marginal cost. So this is what you want to achieve. The benefit of doing so is the area under the environmental cost curve. That's this area here. The cost of doing so is this square here, or rectangle I should say. So the net benefit is this triangle, right? Now let's assume that the industry indeed succeeds in reducing the standards. So abatement is lower, falls from AM to AV. So there is a price to pay in terms of the environment, but still in this particular graph, this agreement is actually net beneficial, because if this is the level of abatement, then this is the environmental benefit. It is smaller, right? It's smaller by this amount here. But the costs are also substantially lower, because the cost of emission reduction is now no longer the area under the CM line, but under the CV line. So these are the costs of emission reduction, and then the net benefit is this area here. So there is a reduction in environmental benefit, but also a reduction in the costs, and in this particular case, this area here is much smaller than this area here, so there is a net gain, a net social gain from engaging in this voluntary agreement. Of course, this all depends on the parameters that you pick in, the steepness of the benefit curve, and of course the distance between the cost curves, right? But in this particular example, it actually makes sense to enter into a voluntary agreement. You can play a little game here, and the question is, well, it's a voluntary agreement. How do you actually get the polluters to stick with that agreement? If it's truly voluntary, they can walk away any time. And let's look at that in a three-stage game. The first stage, the regulator acts, and the decision that the regulator needs to make is, do we offer a voluntary agreement, yes or no? Then the polluter responds to that. They either accept the voluntary agreement or they reject the voluntary agreement. And then you need some sort of stick. And in this game, the stick is Parliament. The problem with Parliament is that they're unpredictable, so they either may enact regulation, then you end up here, or if the voluntary agreement was rejected, you end up here, and the situation is actually the same. But Parliament cannot be counted on, and there's only a probability P of actually passing this legislation and going for the mandatory program. So that is the situation. Now, it's a three-stage game, and you always solve them from back to front. So the first question we need to ask is, would the firm accept or reject the voluntary agreement that was offered? Well, if they accept the voluntary agreement, then these are their costs. CV times AV, that is the cost that they face. If they reject it, then if Parliament acts, their costs are CM times AM, which in this particular graph is higher. So that is not good, but there's only a probability P that this happens, so really they should discount that. And the firm accepts voluntary agreement if this is the case, right? If this condition holds, if the costs of the mandatory program times the probability of it occurring are greater than the cost of the voluntary program. And in that case, the firm would accept. Now, solving it backwards, right? So the regulator needs to make a decision whether or not to offer a voluntary agreement based on what it knows about the firm and how it will respond. So the regulator knows that this is a condition. Through the negotiations, CV and CEM were actually revealed. So the regulator knows this by now, and the decision it needs to make is, do we offer a voluntary agreement? And by now information has been revealed, so we will not offer a voluntary agreement. That would be rejected. That is just silliness. So if we offer a voluntary agreement, we end up with probability 1 in this situation. And that should be compared to not making a voluntary agreement. Then there is a chance that you will end up with a mandatory program, but there's also a chance that you will end up with no regulation whatsoever. And assuming that the regulator tries to maximize social value, there's no selfish bureaucrat here. The condition for the regulator to offer the voluntary agreement is that this thing is greater than this thing here, right? That the social value, social benefit, net social benefit of offering the voluntary agreement and offering such a voluntary agreement that it's acceptable is greater than the net social benefit of a mandatory program times the probability of Parliament actually installing that particular program, actually passing the necessary legislation. And that gives you some constraints on the parameters. Now, a lot of this is fairly intuitive, and that's another reason why I show this, because this may seem intimidating. There's a free state game, and there's conditions here and conditions there, and there's a probability and such and so on. But a lot of it is actually, when you slowly think through it, is actually fairly straightforward. And this free state game actually solves rather intuitively, and the result is exactly what you would expect intuitively. And the math here, the notation here, may be scary, may be off-putting, but when you walk through it calmly, it actually isn't, right? So that is another reason why I show this. Sometimes academics get into this, well, let's come up with all sorts of fancy notation to scare off people, but really it isn't scary at all. And it's just a way of thinking through things systematically. And don't be intimidated by that. So some people use this to intimidate you, but they're just assholes. Now, to wrap this up. So voluntary agreements may solve the information problem that we have in direct regulation. There are other reasons for companies to voluntarily reduce environmental pollution. And one reason is that their clients, their consumers, want this. What we see in the market is that environmentally friendly goods can be sold at a higher price. They're also typically more expensive to make, so you need to get a higher price. But typically the profit margins are also larger. And then it just becomes in the self-interest of that company to do so. And it's not just that this is a way of segmenting the market. My products are greener than the products of my competitor, so that gives me an advantage. There's also a negative element there, and that is, if you don't do that, you lose reputation and you may end up with a consumer boycott. And we've seen that in recent years, time and time again, that a particular company does something, or it is revealed that they do something, and then people say, I'm not going to buy your stuff anymore. And that is a real cost to a company. If all your consumers walk away, then you lose the reason for your existence if you're a company. And it's not just consumers who demand this, but it is increasingly the case that employees and prospective employees also demand that companies behave responsibly. And this is a real issue. When I started my studies, we did a round of introduction, and one of the questions was, who do you want to work for? This is a long time ago. Most of my fellow students, or many of my fellow students, said they wanted to work for Royal Dutch Shell. Because that was a solid company that paid well, that treated its workers well, and great career prospects, and so on and so forth. It's just a great company to work for. Now, just before graduation, we did the same round. Who do you want to work for now that you're almost done? And perhaps surprisingly, nobody wanted to work for Royal Dutch Shell anymore. And the reason was that Shell had gotten into two big scandals. One, systematic collaboration is maybe a better word, with the apartheid regime in South Africa. I'm revealing my age here. And the other was involvement in the murder of a activist in Nigeria who had protested against the exploitation of oil reserves in that country. And Shell had taken such a battering in reputation that nobody wanted to work for it anymore. And this is very costly because initially they essentially could pick their employees. They had the first choice among the crop of good students, and they could choose who they would hire. And that's exactly the sort of people you want in your company. 4 years later, they actually were bottom of the heap, and they actually had to accept people who could not find a job for another company. So this is potentially extremely costly for a company. If you don't get high quality workers, then the quality of your company quickly declines. And now, some of these reasons, consumer boycott, market segmentation, good selection of people who want to work for you, continue to work for you, those are genuine reasons why companies want to reduce their pollution. Sometimes it's also the case that a company is actually genuinely green, that the leaders of the company genuinely care for the environment. Unilever, up to a couple of months ago, was one example. They kicked out the CEO. Ford, under Bill Ford III, was another example. Sometimes it's self-interest, sometimes it is just that there's an environmentalist at the helm of the company, and some of it is just greenwashing. Once upon a time we were allowed to travel and visit hotels, and this is the sort of things that you could see in a hotel, where in this particular case people are encouraged to shower together, and that saves a lot of water. And that's one reason, and they also say it's way more fun to shower together. It depends on who you're showering with. The other thing that you see in basically every hotel nowadays is that if you put your towel on the hook, then you will reuse it, and you are encouraged to reuse it. Whereas you can also put it on the floor, and then they will change it, and then people are urged not to do it because they're saving the world. If they reuse that towel. And this may seem to be genuinely good for the environment, but you should not forget that, of course, the water bill for a big hotel is pretty large, and the laundry bill for a hotel is actually one of the major costs. So yes, this is good for the environment, but it's also very good for the bottom line of the hotel. And in this case, it's very unclear which of the two got the company to actually put up these particular stickers in their shower.